From the north across these peaceful waters comes a shadow, Japan.
I think I have probably never been terribly relaxed because my childhood was a sense of foreboding, really.
Even as a child, one could work out that the empire, which we were part of, couldn't protect us.
Everybody sung. I suppose in our street alone there would be 6 to 8 boys lost.
Well, we had no radios and no televisions, and I think Dad had a crystal set, is that what you would have called it? Yeah, crystal set. Well, he was the only one that listened to it at night, and he would have been listening to about the war in Europe.
The large weekly news, Auckland Weekly, and it had pages of, about 4 pages of deaths, wounded, missing.
There'd been a string of military disasters, particularly in the Pacific. There'd been a couple of British battleships sunk by Japanese aircraft in December. The fall of Singapore came as a huge shock. That was supposed to be the impregnable fortress which was going to protect us, and of course the Japanese were sweeping south, and 4 days after the fall of Singapore, which was the 15th of February 1942, they bombed Australia in several places. So there was this fear that an invasion was possible.
All of the good lads of New Zealand had gone to Europe to fight, not realizing that World War II would break out in their own backyard.
There was a large call-up of people out of industry. The Home Guard, as you're probably aware, was mobilised, and there were thousands of men involved in that, and we started digging trenches and barricades and constructing tank traps and basically preparing ourselves for this invasion. And the Home Guard took it very, very seriously, and they were constructing defences and gun positions, and actually, constructing dummy guns as well to make things look pretty solid. So there was a hive of activity around this time.
It was just incredible. We didn't know what was happening. And then of course, suddenly Petone was filled with these handsome men in green uniforms wandering around at the movies and at church at Mass on a Sunday.
Well, it was, I guess, for children, it was massive excitement because we'd never seen anything in our days that looked like this, with all these war vehicles and jeeps and motorbikes.
Well, the US forces arrived about mid-1942, and their arrival hadn't been announced, so when they turned up it came as a shock to a lot of the New Zealand populace that there were these strange men in uniform. And in fact, it felt like an invasion, but a friendly invasion.
We were alone in the bottom of the Pacific, and I think the fact that their troops were here made us all feel a bit more secure.
As young girls, of course we were curious. Well, who are they? Who are all these handsome men that sound like film stars,
And I think they were something different from what we'd ever seen or ever known.
They were different. They were unlike our own servicemen. They had different uniforms. They were well paid. They spoke differently. They had a whole range of terminology, American expressions, which weren't that familiar at the time. So they were greeted with, I think, warmth and curiosity at the start.
They made friends quicker, and they I think they laughed more.
Well, the camps for the American forces, like the camps for the New Zealand forces, were all built by the New Zealand Public Works Department acting for the New Zealand government. And the camps for the Marines in this Wellington region were at Paikokariki, north of here, and in this area in what is now Porua City, there was a camp at Tahanui, one at Judgeford, one at Titahi Bay, and one at what is now known as Ngāti Toa Domain, just off Mana Esplanade, between Parramatta and Plympton.
There was enormous curiosity about what was going on, and the hills in those days were all sand hills and covered in lupin bushes, and because Americans had these hotshot guards around the camp perimeter, all armed with Thompson submachine guns, and they shot the odd cow and things like that, and so we knew full well that you had to look pretty slippy to get inside, and we found that from the southern end we could sort of work our way down the fence line, and when the guards' backs were turned we'd go through the lupins and we'd be in the camp, and once you're in the camp, of course, it was, hey Yank, got a Hershey bar or whatever, you see.
Well, they're primarily preparing for operations in the South Pacific, and they needed places that had infrastructure so they could bring in supplies and so forth, but they needed places that had training areas, and that's predominantly what they were doing here, training, getting ready for operations in the South Pacific, and training predominantly amphibious type training, so putting people on land and craft and coming in from the shore.
And the Paikakariki beach in those days was very different to today. It was sandbars and big hollows. Now when the tide came in, a metre or so, because the sandbars were gone, and the hollows, trenches, were all that much deeper. And often a man with a heavy pack and a rifle would go into one of these hollows and just never come out.
The United States President actually sent out a young naval officer to check the marine camps here in New Zealand at one stage. He was a reserve naval officer, and he wrote back to the President of the United States with glowing reports, but he happened to be Lyndon Baines Johnson, who later on became President of the United States.
I loved Warren. We were kind of suited, if you know. He was a kind American, if you know what I mean.
We had to sit by Dad while he played the piano, and I've never seen a man play the piano with his head turned round the wrong way, back to front really, virtually keeping an eye on my sister and I while he played the piano.
My mother loved him just like our boys, and Dad thought he was marvellous, and my father was a funny old devil.
And these Marines would some of them were dancing together. They were throwing themselves around and dancing, and this was jitterbugging. We didn't know anything about it. We'd never been to a dance before, so we didn't even know anything about it. And they'd come up and ask us to dance, and Dad would say, "No, the girls can't dance." And they'd probably think, "Well, what the heck are they doing here?" You know.
We were walking home from this wedding in Cuba Street, and I said to Warren, "You know, that was a lovely wedding, Warren. I hope they'll be happy, and I hope nothing happens to him." And he said, "It should have been mine." I said, "Yours?" He said, "Ours, Dopey, ours." I said, "Are you proposing to me or not?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And that's how he said, "And I've got a ring, so you better say yes."
And as we were leaving, this big, tall, thin, sick-looking guy asked if he could see me again. And Dad said, "No, the girls don't go out with the blokes, and they're not going out with the Marine."
And we got married. We filled all the papers in and got married, and that was it. And then everybody thought I was pregnant. Everybody in our street thought, "Ha ha, you know, Yankees, they'll get her pregnant." And I wasn't, I'm sorry to say.
And then the next night about 7 o'clock, there's a knock on the door, and there he was. And pockets full of sweets and gum and cigarettes for anyone that smoked, and he came in, and we were absolutely transfixed. We sat on the floor. I think I say in my book, no American ever had such unadulterated adoration and attention from 5 girls and a mum and dad who were absolutely overwhelmed by this handsome young guy.
And I said, "I think I'm pregnant." He said, "Do I get up and tell everybody?" I said, No, don't tell anybody," I said. And I was, and then I wrote all the time because he was on the boat, and I wrote all the time. And then he got transferred to another ship, And that's when evidently...
You know, I went from being a naive girl to being dated by a 22-year-old Marine who was seemed a bit old, you know, because I was only just coming up to 18, and but it was nothing, and it was a lovely, lovely way for me to start growing up.
I couldn't believe it took a lot, and I wasn't very good. I didn't act and behave nicely and take the news nicely. I cried and screamed and went on like a silly old chook. I'm afraid I wasn't very good at all.
Slowly and painfully, the Japanese were forced back towards their homeland.
Amphibious operations are always risky. You're going into a defended enemy shoreline, you're exposed, and you're particularly at your worst when you come out of the landing craft and cross the beach, which can be very, very wide. And the Japanese are expert at defending those perimeters. They've turned every shoreline into a lethal killing zone, and that's exactly where the Marines have to advance through. So you're quite right. The casualty rates for the Marines fighting in the South Pacific starts with Guadalcanal and goes right through, and to several other island atolls as well. Their casualty rates are absolutely horrendous.
There was no mistake about it. This was a very committed, professional enemy that they had to face, and these boys were young recruits, young inductees, I should say, and this was their first face of battle, their first time in these hellish conditions. And as I say, New Zealand was the last place they got that family meal and a sense of family and a sense of peace.
It was published in our paper, and that was the day that was the day they landed in Tarawa. Over 1,000 were killed. My mother and father couldn't console us. We'd go down the list, read the list. Every second person was someone that we knew, or someone that somebody knew. One of our friends knew. They were all the guys who were here.
Old St. Paul's is such a treasure to not just the history of New Zealand, but it's a treasure to the history of the United States Marine Corps. That's where the Marines, while they were here, that's where they prayed to a higher being, that's where they congregated, that's where they, Sunday services, that's perhaps where they met a lovely young lady with her family.
I decided to write To Follow Me and find out if anybody remembered us, the Love family from Petone. Just tongue-in-cheek, thinking, oh well, somebody might. And on about February 1993, I got a letter one day, and it was from one of the Marines that my dad had brought home. And I opened the envelope, and a whole bunch of photos fell out, and all these photos that this guy had saved for 50 years.
Some of the Marines they decided New Zealand was where they wanted to live, and they came here married or with fiancés, or they took their fiancés off to America after the war and then came back. And as I move around the countryside, I still come across these fellows, old men now, of course.
I think their presence had changed New Zealand forever, in that they were the first large number of foreigners who came here en masse and stayed here and interacted with the local communities, and I think that had a long-term impact. We shouldn't forget that, as I said before, nearly 1,400 New Zealand women sail away to live on the other side of the world, and they maintain family connections. But the Marines also, Marines and the other United States servicemen when they were here, also had a lasting impact on the New Zealanders. I mean, New Zealanders had seen these people who were different, and they weren't British. They had different values, attitudes and so forth. They liked things differently, and they actually had things that we'd never seen before. We'd never known what dry cleaning was until they arrived, for example, and we hadn't had I guess the habit of dining out like they did, and so on, the entertainment and their music and culture. And I think that it strengthens the bond between the two countries that formed, and I think it grew stronger after the war, because we knew these people, we'd seen them, and in the main we quite liked them.
And I think that I'm a very, very fortunate person, because nobody in this world can take my memories away from me.
And so the only youth they knew was the 8 or 9 months that they spent in New Zealand. Then they went off to war, and they didn't know their youth again. You don't get it back.
When personal friends come to visit, I personally escort them to St. Paul's to let them see firsthand some of the history of the United States and its involvement with the New Zealand people and in this country from World War II on. And when they look up and see that World War II American flag and the Marine Corps banner, then it's just, you get a big smile of pride.